It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Gather around the campfire, kiddos, for I have a tale about Jason Voorhees. As a child, he appeared to have drowned while the counselors at Camp Crystal Lake were too busy playing grab-ass with each other. For revenge upon the reopening of Camp Crystal Lake, counselors began dying brutally murdered, and the murderer is revealed to be Jason's mother, Pamela. Her anger over how she lost her son 20 years earlier never went away, and she intended to punish those who intended to keep the camp open. But years later, more counselors arrive at Camp Crystal Lake to open it for a camp counselor school. More murders occur, and it appears that Jason, a mentally and physically handicapped boy, never actually drowned. Instead, he managed to live up to his adulthood in the woods, essentially as a wild man. He witnessed his mother's death, got his revenge on the woman who killed Pamela, and then began stalking the young adults at the camp counselor school. He would continue to kill for 2 more days whenever youngsters came around the lake and defended his turf until he messed with the Jarvis family. Young Tommy Jarvis, a horror makeup and effects enthusiast, finally killed Jason in a showdown. And Jason was indeed dead. However, kids, you see, the power of the almighty dollar continued to coax Paramount Pictures to make more films. After 4 extremely popular films, Paramount made a 5th film. This time, the youngsters at a camp for disturbed teenagers, including a traumatized Tommy Jarvis, now a young adult, start getting killed brutally. It appears to be Jason, who everybody thought was dead and buried, committing the killings. It turns out to be an angry and estranged father of one of the disturbed kids at the place who that kid was killed by a violent delinquent. But Jason was indeed, at least at this point, dead. And that catches us up to what I'm going to be talking about in this week's episode. 1986's Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. But wait, how is Jason living? Didn't I just say that Jason was indeed dead? Yes, and that's what makes this movie an important turning point in the Friday the 13th series. The slasher genre is mostly one that is strictly and kind of possessively belonging to Generation X, my generation. We grew up on this stuff, man. I mean, for Gen Xers, my brother's ages, they could go to the drive-in or theater to see the movies. For Gen Xers my age, we got to rent them at the video store for sleepovers on the weekends. But that distinction between what the older Gen Xers and what the younger Gen Xers think is the quintessential Jason Voorhees is kind of split between the first 3 appearances of the killer in parts 2, 3, and then the final chapter, which was the 4th movie, and what the older, and the killer in the 3 final appearances of the series, 6, 7, and 8. Now remember, Jason is not the killer in the 1st and 5th films. So for the most part, the older Gen Xers like my brothers think of Jason being the guy from the 2nd or 3rd Friday the 13th movies as kind of a crazed wild man in the woods around Crystal Lake. For the younger group like me, we think of him as this supernatural monster of sorts, the zombie Jason, the one who makes his first appearance in this movie. For half of the series, the killer is just a guy. Sure, the first person is a grieving mother. The second is that wild man who is vicious for sure, but is just a crazed wild man with developmental issues. The third was a grieving father. The back half is where you have the supernatural zombie monster Jason. He's the one that some of us think of first when we hear the name Jason Voorhees. He's the guy we get a thrill from, having, greater strength and a more distinctively rotten look to him. He's the guy who, in the following films, subtitled The New Blood, we have a cool scene of seeing his face after the telekinetic heroine of the film causes his hockey mask to break and fall off his face. That look of his decayed visage was even featured on a cover of Fangoria that I remember my brothers getting at the drugstore one day. This movie also happens to be my favorite in the franchise too. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, this is the final part of what fans have come to call the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. Late one night, Tommy and another person he met while he spent time in a mental institution, Alan, played by Ron Palillo, who is famous for being Horshack on Walking Back Kotter. They drive to the cemetery in Crystal Lake, which has now been renamed Forest Green to forget the town's violent past. And this is for Tommy to get solace that Jason Voorhees is truly dead. They dig up and open his coffin to find the rotten corpse of Jason Voorhees. He truly is dead, as dead can be, after Tommy killed him in the 4th installment. And again, it is hilariously titled that 4th movie is the final chapter, and there were 6 more Jason movies after this. But reliving trauma from his past, he angrily takes an iron post from the cemetery's fence and stabs the corpse over and over. But before Tommy can light the body on fire, which was his intention, to cremate him, and to forever rid him of that trauma from his childhood, lightning strikes the iron post sticking out of Jason's body and resurrects him. Jason crawls out of his grave, attacks Tommy, and then kills Alan while Tommy eventually is able to escape. Now, Tommy tries to get help from the local authorities while Jason roams freely in the woods. Sheriff Mike Garris knows this is Tommy Jarvis, someone who has, last he heard, severe mental issues. And while he is apologetic about what happened to Tommy's family, he's not going to let this punk kid bring back all the bad memories and panic around Jason Voorhees. Meanwhile, Jason comes across a couple who are on their way to the camp to meet the others, expecting kids to arrive soon, and Jason kills these two with little to no provocation. But the next day, Sheriff Garris's looker of a daughter, Megan, asks for her dad to send out a deputy to look for their missing counselors. And Tommy, who was there in the jail cell, basically sleeping it off before they can kick him out of town, tells her that, and the other counselors, worried about their friends, that they may have run afoul of Jason. Now, Megan instantly takes a liking to Tommy, and Megan is kind of into the legend of Jason and wonders if maybe it isn't just a legend that their parents told their kids. But anyway, the counselors end up having a little bit more pressing matters as a whole right away because a bus load of kids arrive for the camp. Now, while the counselors welcome these kids and Tommy continues to try to convince Sheriff Garris and his trigger-happy deputy Pappas that Jason is alive and running amok, Jason is getting caught up on all the killing he's not been able to do since Tommy put him in his grave some years back. He kills a whole group of corporate retreat folks in a paintball war. He kills the cemetery's caretaker who covered up his grave again, making it harder for the police to believe Tommy and actually act upon what Tommy was saying. And he then kills a couple with one stab of his machete, getting both of them like a shish kebab. All the while, he is getting closer to the camp where the counselors and those kids are. Now, speaking of the counselors, Megan decides to go back to the sheriff's station to see her dad, while another of the counselors is messing around with his girlfriend, who picked him up in her father's camper. Now, because Jason has a pretty finely tuned sex radar and always has, even when he was a living, breathing person, now he has it extra boosted because he's a supernatural zombie monster. He realizes that there's some sex going on, so he decides to mess with the camper and the couple before eventually killing them, causing the camper to wreck and explode. It's a really pretty cool scene with Jason standing on top of the flame engulfed camper. It's good stuff. But this leads to Sheriff Garris thinking that Tommy is responsible for the couple's death because he thinks the kid is crazy. He thinks he's trying to take on the embodiment of Jason Voorhees as opposed to warning people about a zombie monster Jason Voorhees, but whatever. Tommy was escorted out of the town earlier, but he still wants to try to stop what he unwittingly unleashed at the start of the movie. So he stops off at a phone booth and calls the sheriff's station to find Megan manning the phone. Now, she doesn't think Tommy is responsible. Instead, she thinks he's hot. So she decides to help him out by going to pick him up and help while her dad is out looking for him. So while the sheriff is looking for Tommy, Megan is helping Tommy, and Tommy is prepping himself for a final showdown with Jason. Jason has arrived at the grounds of the camp and is cutting phone lines and gets right to work by killing the two counselors at the camp by twisting one of the girls' heads all the way around and off her body, while two, painting the walls of the cabin with the other girl's blood and briefly stalking the kids while they are asleep in bed. Interesting story. I always liked this. There was some sense that because Jason kind of had the mind of a child and had the development of a child, that was always the thing that we would always say to each other as friends, that, oh, he wasn't going to hurt a kid. He himself is a kid. And sure enough, he never actually hurts any kids. He scares them, but he doesn't hurt them. But anyway, elsewhere, Megan and Tommy are caught by the cops, but she eventually breaks him out. And when they get out, they hurry to the camp where Megan will protect the kids while Tommy plans to lure Jason out into the lake and sink him there with a chain around his neck that is tied to a heavy rock. Now, Sheriff Garrison and his deputy finally realize that they are indeed dealing with Jason, but they are pretty ineffective as they both die pretty quickly, as well as some other cops. Garrus dies by being bent backwards in half while luring Jason essentially away from Megan to save her life. Now, Tommy rows out into the lake with his boulder and chain. He too lures Jason to the lake before Jason can kill Megan. And turns out that this is one time in which Jason can be reasoned with. Tommy says he's the one that Jason wants. And yeah, Jason agrees by making a beeline to him out in the lake. And I like that Tommy kind of doesn't quite think this all the way through, because he's out deep enough in the lake that as Jason walks into the lake, he eventually goes all the way underwater, and that gives Jason an advantage to basically sneak attack Tommy when he's not expecting it and jump out on the other side of the boat. But it does give Tommy the chance to light a ring of fire around the boat. Now, I think this was all based on a book about the occult that Tommy read that gave him the idea of how to stop zombie monster Jason by putting him back in the lake where he died in the first place. But anyway, Tommy and Jason fight, and Tommy is successful in getting that chain around Jason's neck and is able to get him stuck underneath the water. And basically, as the boulder falls all the way down to the bottom of the lake, Jason is pretty much stuck there. But Megan goes out to save Tommy, who might be drowning out there, and Jason grabs onto her. But for extra good measure, Megan slices Jason's throat on the propeller blade from the boat's motor, and she pulls Tommy ashore. She saves Tommy with some CPR, and the threat of Jason is ended for now. However, even though he is indeed at the bottom of the Crystal Lake, he still has one eye open and waiting for and plotting for his eventual return. Now let's get to the three things that I like. No, scratch that actually. The things I love about Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. First up, while I admit the fourth entry, the final chapter, is likely the best one written and made and acted, this is the one that I have the most nostalgia for. It's mostly through the little things about this, but there are things I really do love about the movie, and it's the one that I will watch time and time again. So that starts with the opening scene of this movie. We jump right the hell in with Tommy already having a plan to rid the world of any chance of Jason coming back. So he digs up Jason. We get to see the dude's gnarly body in his grave. Then we get that great shot of the lightning striking and causing the explosion that brings Jason back to life. Then Jason kills Horshack. But he doesn't just stab him with a knife or with a machete or anything. No. He punches through his body and removes his heart. And just for good measure, he then dumps the body into his now open grave. But as Jason dons his familiar hockey mask, we get a zoom into his eye where Jason does like a James Bond-like parody, like it's the famous gun barrel sequence at the beginning of a Bond film, except this is Jason Voorhees, so he doesn't shoot a gun when he turns to the camera. He slashes with his machete. It's great. It's a scene I've seen maybe, I don't know, 100 times. It was something as a kid that got me immediately hooked into the movie, and it has stuck with me for nearly 40 years. Second, there are, as I said, there are little things about Jason Lives that I think makes this kind of a special entry in the series. One, yes, it's the start of Zombie Jason. But that's kind of the least of what makes this the most different entry in the series. There's a sense of humor to this movie and a lot of homage that I greatly appreciate. As for the humor, there's a lot of good editing here and a few nods to the audience. For example, as Megan talks about the legend of Jason, she comments on something much scarier. Those kids arriving in the bus, screaming and yelling and being what will eventually be a handful for the rest of our cast. There's some really good editing in the scene in which Jason kills the people on the corporate retreat. That's almost played for laughs. I mean, it's self-aware with the first couple that Jason kills, when he first gets resurrected, with them commenting about seeing enough horror movies to know that they are in trouble when they see a guy like that. The movie does not take itself very seriously, and I think it's why it's become a favorite for so many. We have the cemetery caretaker with two very memorable comedic lines. The first, when he discovers Jason's grave has been dug up, he looks directly at the camera and chastises the audience for having a funny idea about entertainment. He then also asks if a character thinks that he is a quote-unquote fart head. And then there's a smash cut to the kids at the camp yelling, yes! It's really funny editing that really it really makes you want to have fun with the movie. The kills are over the top to the point of themselves being pretty silly. But all this comes from director Tom McLaughlin. Now, McLaughlin pulled a lot of inspiration from the Universal classic monsters. In particular, he pulls from Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. Being struck by lightning brings Jason back to life like it did Frankenstein's monster. The comedic overtones comes from The Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, it's great. It's also, interestingly, the only film in the series to not feature nudity. Nudity being one of the pillars of 80s slasher horror, but it's mostly R-rated for language and the silly, over-the-top kind of cartoonishly gruesome deaths, I would say. Honestly, this movie could actually be suitable for kids of a certain age, maybe 10 to 15 or something like that. And that's another thing. This is the only entry in the series to actually show children coming to Camp Crystal Lake for, camp. I mean, it's ostensibly the whole reason why anybody's there for Jason to kill in the first place. Well, yeah, they finally do it in this movie. It's all these little things that make this movie wonderful. Thirdly, I really like our two leads, Tom Matthews as Tommy and Jennifer Cook as Megan. They work really well together. She's not only cute, but she's also kind of spunky. I mean, she's an active participant in Tommy's plans to stop Jason by trying to help him get materials for what he needs to do what he needs to do, and then later breaking him out of her father's station. She didn't do so much in terms of acting, Jennifer Cook. In fact, this was her final year of making movies or TV shows. She did have a 2-year run on Guiding Light. Just before this movie, she was in the V television series, in which she played a relatively important character of a visitor human hybrid with special powers. She did have a role in the sex comedy Gimme an F with the star of 2 Nightmare on Elm Street movies, Lisa Wilcox. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of interesting. Tom Matthews is a bigger name in horror. Prior to playing Tommy, he was in the incredibly popular cult classic Return of the Living Dead. He'd go on to reprise his role as Tommy in a series of fan films that have been releasing over the last 10 years or so. They are really good and engaging together in this. I don't see either of them being, like the stupid horror characters. I mean, yeah, Tommy is the reason why Jason is revived. It is kind of funny. He's the reason why Jason dies in one and is revived in another. But they are facing the Jason threat head on. And for once, we actually see those kids at the camp. So it's neat to see a counselor going to save the kids and protect them from Jason. That's good stuff. Then when it comes to Tommy Jarvis, he's really the only returning character in one of these movies that doesn't get killed. And he appeared in 3 movies, making him the foremost expert on Jason Voorhees. He's the closest thing to being a lead character in the entire series. And I just really like Matthews and Cook together in this. I love this movie. I watch it almost once every year. It's a great deal of fun. I still love watching it whenever I get a chance. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload that stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, it's time to have some visions of a killer who gets reincarnated, where he was once a crazy guy, and then he becomes, for some reason, a greaser rocker with a guitar that has a giant drill at the end of it. Anyway, yeah, another one of those resurrected killers. So join me for Slumber Party Massacre 2. So until next week, stay spooky.